Hi, I'm Bob Flexner and I want to welcome you to this video on applying finishes. Most woodworkers don't like finishing because they're afraid of screwing up their woodwork. But there's really only one thing that you can do that's not easy to fix, and that is to apply a stain to a blotchy wood like this cherry. All other problems are fairly easy to fix. Worst case scenario is that you'd have to strip off the finish and start all over. In contrast to the many tools that you use in woodworking, there are only three used to apply finishes: a rag, a brush, and a spray gun. All are very simple to use. Even the spray gun is no more complicated to use than a router. There are two broad categories of finishes: those that contain oil or wax, so they don't cure hard, so you have to wipe off all the excess after each coat, and all the rest: varnish, shellac, lacquer, and water base, which do cure hard, so you can build them to a thicker, more protective coating. Let's begin with oil finishes. Oil finishes are very easy to apply, which is probably the reason they're so popular. All you need to do is wipe the oil onto the wood, brush it or spray it, or you can pour the oil onto the wood and spread it around, and then let it sit wet on the wood for 5 to 10 minutes so that it has time to soak into the wood. You may notice that after a minute or two, some dry spots, some dry parts appear in the wood as the oil soaks into the wood. Come back over with the cloth and wipe more oil onto those spots and keep the surface wet for 5 to 10 minutes. Then take a dry cloth and wipe off all the excess oil. After a short time, you may notice that little spots of oil reappear on the surface, and these spots are oil bleeding back up out of the pores. Wipe them off and continue to come back, if you notice them, for every 15 to 30 minutes, and wipe off these spots so they don't have time to cure. Now you've got a problem with oily rags. These oily rags are dangerous because they're a fire hazard. If you leave them piled up, the heat that is generated as a result of the curing of the oil can't get out, and so it builds up to the combustion temperature of the rag and causes the rags to catch fire. So spread the rags out by draping them over the edge of a table or a trash can, or take them outside and hang them over a limb or a fence so that they can get air so that they won't heat up, and then they're safe. Then let the oil cure overnight. Next day, sand the wood lightly with very fine grit sandpaper, just enough to make it feel smooth. Now here's a trick. Many woodworkers think that to get the nicest results, they need to sand the wood to 400 grit before they apply the oil. But you can get the same smooth results if you just sand the wood to about 220 grit, and then between coats sand with 400 or 600 grit sandpaper. Personally, I prefer 600 grit. Sand all the wood and then dust it, and then apply a second coat of oil. Now here's another trick. Instead of sanding the wood and then putting on the second coat of oil, put the coat of oil on first and then sand it while the oil is still wet. You will combine two steps into one, and you will make the wood feel just a little bit smoother because the oil acts as a lubricant for the sandpaper. Then wipe off all the excess oil. You don't need to let this second coat sit on the wood for as long as you did the first coat, because the wood should already be sealed from the first coat. Wipe off all the excess oil, and then you can sometimes gain a little bit by putting on a third coat. If you can raise the sheen or make the sheen just a little bit nicer with a third coat, then it's a good thing to do. But as soon as you get to the point where an additional coat doesn't raise the sheen any, doesn't make the wood look any nicer or feel any nicer, then there's no point in going on, because you're not getting any build, because the oil doesn't cure hard, so you've got to wipe off all the excess. You can't build it. There's a lot of myths about oil finishes. For example, that in some way the oil protects the surface of the wood from the inside, and that's nonsense. Or that the oil, which doesn't get hard in the first place, in some way makes the wood, which is already hard, get harder. or that some beneficial effect can be gained by rubbing the oil into the surface beyond just a good aerobic exercise. Or a new myth that's gotten started is that you can get the same equivalent results as I've gotten by applying both coats of oil within about 45 minutes of each other instead of letting the first coat cure overnight. That's not true, because applying the second coat within 45 minutes of the first coat isn't dry yet, isn't cured, and so therefore it's just like applying one coat. When you can take the wood and put your nose up against it and smell, and not smell anything, then the oil is cured and the wood is ready to put into service. There's a lot of confusion about sealing wood. Wood has pores in it, and when you put the first coat of finish on, the finish goes down into the pore, cures, and stops up the pores, which is sealing the wood. So the first coat of any finish seals the wood. First coat is by definition the sealer coat. All additional coats are top coats. The problem is that the first coat locks raised wood fibers in place, which makes the wood feel rough. You should sand off these raised fibers so that the wood feels smooth before you go on with your top coats. But many finishes are difficult to sand. Varnish and lacquer are examples. So manufacturers make a special product called properly a sanding sealer, but oftentimes abbreviated just sealer, which causes part of the confusion, that sands real easily. It powders up. You don't need to sand this much. I'm just sanding more so that you can see the powder. Just go over it lightly to knock off the raised wood fibers. The sanding sealer is to speed production. That's the reason that you use it. There's a lot of myth about sealing, like for instance that you would use a sanding sealer in order to get a better bond to the wood. But sanding sealers don't give better bonds to the wood. The finish bonds perfectly well to the wood anyway. The sanding sealer, the soap-like lubricant in the sanding sealer actually inhibits the bond to the wood. Another myth is that you should thin the first coat of finish with 25 to 50% thinner in order to get a better bond to the wood. But you're really thinning the first coat of finish so that it dries harder, faster, so that you can sand it easier sooner. There are 4 finishes that are commonly brushed on wood. There's varnish. Remember that polyurethane is a type of varnish. There's shellac. There's brushing lacquer, which is regular lacquer that's made so that it dries slower so that you can brush it. And there's water-based finish. The varnish is the most protective and durable of the 4. Varnish also cures slower, so you have more time to brush it, but there's more time for dust to collect. Shellac, brushing lacquer, and water-based finishes dry much faster, so you have less time to brush, but then you have fewer dust problems too. Brushing a finish is just like brushing paint. You spread the finish onto the wood and then line up the brush strokes with the grain, just like you would paint. Lining up the brush strokes is called tipping off. There are a lot of myths about how to brush a finish, like brush across the grain and then with the grain, brush only in one direction, brush slowly. It really doesn't make any difference. You just want to get the finish on the wood and the brush marks lined up with the grain wherever possible. Varnish gives you more time to do this. You have less time when you are brushing shellac or brushing lacquer or water-based finish, just as you have less time when you're brushing latex paint as opposed to oil paint. So if you're brushing a finish that dries real fast, you need to, before you start, plan how you're going to do the different parts. Like on this spice rack, it's a fairly complex surface. I may not be able to get all the finish on all over the surface and then line up the brush strokes, so I want to do one part at a time. So before you start, think about how you can divide each part and do them one at a time. There are 5 common problems brushing finishes. The first is runs and sags. It's very difficult to brush a finish onto a vertical surface without the finish running a little bit or sagging. In order to see what's happening, you have to work in a reflected light. So you need to arrange your light so that you can see a reflection off of the surface. Otherwise you won't see if you get a run or a sag. It's almost impossible to brush without them, so the way to handle them is to let them happen and then run your brush back over the surface and wipe it off on the lip of a clean jar. And keep wiping or brushing back over until the finish stops running and sagging. The second problem is air bubbles occurring in the finish. You've probably heard that you can prevent air bubbles by not shaking the can or stirring it. And if you've tried it, you know that it's not true. That's because air bubbles are caused by turbulence that's created by the brush. You can't really stop air bubbles getting into the finish. What you want to do is allow them enough time to pop out. You do that by slowing down the curing of the finish, by adding 5 to 10% paint thinner to varnish, by adding a little denatured alcohol to shellac, by adding some lacquer thinner to lacquer, or by adding a little water to water-based finishes. Water-based finishes are the most difficult to brush without getting bubbles in the finish. The best way, the most important thing, is that you work in fairly good weather conditions, meaning about 70 degrees temperature and about 40 to 50% humidity. The farther away you get from that, the more problems you're likely to have. If you've still got problems, if you can't get rid of bubbles in water-based finishes, switch to another brand, because some brands are made to work in different weather conditions better. The third problem brushing finishes is brush marks occurring in the finish. You cannot stop brush marks in the finish either. There will always be brush marks, but you can use a better quality brush. You can thin the finish just like with eliminating bubbles. Thin the finish with the proper thinner so that the finish has more time to flatten out. And otherwise, the only way to get rid of brush marks is to sand them out between coats or sand them out at the end of all of your coats. The fourth problem is dust curing in the finish. You can't really stop dust getting in the finish, but you can reduce it by keeping everything as clean as possible. Keep your brush clean, keep the finish clean, keep the wood clean, and keep the air that you're working in clean. Then, the dust that does get in the finish, sand it out between coats. Sand lightly, just enough to take off the dust nibs, and then after the last coat, rub it out, which I'll show you how to do later so that you disguise the dust nibs. The fifth problem is that the finish won't cure. This is caused either by the air being too cold, too humid, or a natural oil in the wood like in teak or cocobolo or ebony or rosewood, interfering with the curing of the finish. This is especially the case when you're applying varnish. The only thing really that you can do is to warm the air in the room to make the finish cure faster, whatever finish it is. To reduce the oil problems in the wood, wipe the wood just before you start applying the finish with a fast evaporating solvent like naphtha or lacquer thinner or acetone to take off the oil off the surface and then apply the finish. Now let me show you something that you may not have already known. All of these products are varnished thinned enough with paint thinner so you can wipe them on the wood. They are wiping varnishes, not tongue oil as many of them claim. You can apply them just like you do an oil finish, wipe them on the wood and then wipe off all the excess before it dries. You just have less time than with an oil finish. Or you can apply them like you do varnish, brushing them on the wood and leaving them. You'll just get less of a build than with varnish. You can make your own by thinning any varnish or polyurethane about half with paint thinner. Spraying produces the most level finish. You can spray any finish. The tricks are to keep the gun, to hold the gun as perpendicular to the wood as possible, and to keep it moving, because if you stop the spray gun, you'll get a build-up of finish and a run. Also, you need to keep the gun, of course, as clean as possible, and you want to spray the least important parts first and the most important parts last. So on this little cherry stool, I'm spraying the legs, except this little part, so I can turn it over. I'm spraying the legs first, then around the edge, and then turn it over, finish off the legs from the top side, then spray the top edge, and then the top. The trick to achieving the best results is good atomization. Atomization means the breaking up of the liquid as it comes out of the spray gun into a very fine mist. You can improve atomization if you're using a conventional gun off of a compressor by increasing the air pressure. You can improve atomization with either a conventional gun or an HVLP gun, high volume, low pressure, by thinning the liquid material that you're spraying, because it takes less pressure to break up or atomize a thinner material. Beyond that, you're at the mercy of the spray gun itself. Better quality spray guns will atomize better, and poor quality spray guns won't atomize as well. If you don't get good atomization, the surface looks like the peel of an orange. That's called orange peeling. I can show you the difference between a better quality spray gun and a poor quality spray gun by using both, spraying black paint on a white surface. This is a lesser quality spray gun, and this is a better quality spray gun, spraying exactly the same material. The basic way to apply a stain is to wipe, brush, or spray the stain onto the wood and then wipe off all the excess before the stain dries. As you can see, an inefficient way would be to brush it. You can wipe or spray much faster. It doesn't make any difference in what direction you put the stain on, and it doesn't make any difference, since you're going to take all the stain off, in which direction you take the stain off. But you get another clean rag and then start wiping the stain off. Again, the big myth in this is that you're supposed to wipe in one direction or brush in one direction and then take off in one direction. The only thing that's important is that the last strokes you make going with the grain, just in case you leave any streaks. The streaks will run with the grain and will be disguised. The biggest problem that you have in staining is blotching. Blotching occurs commonly on woods like this pine here, or on cherry, or on maple or birch. Blotching occurs because the stain penetrates unevenly into the wood. The way to avoid it is to keep the stain from penetrating unevenly. And you have to anticipate that it's going to happen, so you want to practice on some scrap pieces. You have to anticipate it, because if once it occurs, the only way to get rid of it is to sand to below where the blotching has occurred, and that is very difficult. There are two ways to avoid blotching. The easiest is to use a gel stain. Gel stains are thicker, so they don't flow, so they don't penetrate into the wood. I've got a piece of pine here where I've applied a liquid stain on this side and it's blotched. And now I'm going to apply the gel stain to the other side. Apply the stain in the same way that you do a liquid stain. Coat the surface and then wipe off the excess. And you can see that on the gel stain side, there's no blotching, while on the liquid stain side, there is. The second way to handle blotching is to apply a wash coat. A wash coat is a highly thinned finish. You apply it the same way that you apply an oil finish. You wipe it on the wood, or brush it, or spray it, any way. Put it on the wood, and keep the wood wet for 5 to 10 minutes. If there's any dry places that appear in the wood as the wash coat soaks into the wood, then re-wet them, keep it wet for 5 or 10 minutes, and then apply the stain within a short time. I've got another board that I applied a wash coat to about 10 minutes ago. The wash coat is on this side. Nothing has been applied to this side. This is pine. And then I will apply a stain to the entire board. Wipe off the excess. And you can see that the part that I applied the wash coat to came out even, and the part that I didn't apply the wash coat to blotched. There are two disadvantages to using a wash coat instead of a gel stain. The first is that it's more difficult to predict whether you're going to get any blotching or not, and the second is that it's more difficult to predict how dark the color will be. If the color turns out too light or lighter than you want, as this did, then the way to solve it is to apply another coat of stain on top and then not wipe it all off. I'll show you on this pine tabletop. I wash coated this tabletop and then I stained it, and it didn't come out as dark as I wanted. So I'm going to brush some stain on it and not wipe it off. So I build the color on top. I could spray it on, of course, and get an even coating, but it's difficult to do with a rag. I'm not brushing the edges. I just want to show you that it's possible with a brush to get an even coating. The trick is to use a stain that contains both pigment and dye. If you use a stain that contains only pigment, it's very difficult to brush without getting streaks, and also the pigment will muddy the wood. A dye stain you can see through, and so you get good color without muddying the wood. The problem is that manufacturers don't tell you which stains contain pigment and which contain both pigment and dye. But I'll show you how you can do that. Take a light-colored stirring stick and put it about halfway into a can that sat on the shelf long enough for the pigment to have settled to the bottom of the can. If the stirring stick comes out without being colored, it may darken a little bit because liquids always darken wood, but if it's not colored, then the stain only contains pigment. Take another stirring stick and put it into a can about halfway down, and if it comes out colored, then the stain also contains dye, because dye doesn't settle to the bottom of the can like pigment does. When you apply a finish to a porous wood like oak or walnut or mahogany, the finish goes down into the pores, leaving a pitted look which you might not like, especially on surfaces like tabletops which you see in a reflected light. You can fill the pores in two different ways. One way is to keep applying coats of finish, 6 to 12 usually, and then after you've got the finish built up, sand it back so that the surface is level. The other way is to fill the pores first with paste wood filler, wipe it all off the surface, and then apply the coats of finish, which come out nearly flat. I'll show you how to fill the pores using paste wood filler. Paste wood filler is made up of a binder, which is usually varnish, a sand-like substance, silica, which gives bulk, and some pigment, which gives color. Paste wood filler comes sometimes in already mixed it with the colors, and sometimes it comes in neutral, which then you can add the pigment to make the color that you want. Pigments that you would use would be either a universal color pigment, an oil color pigment, or a Japan color pigment. I've made up some paste wood filler using Van Dyke Brown universal color pigment, and then I've thinned it with, in my case, naphtha. It could be thinned either with paint thinner or naphtha to make it about the consistency of white or yellow glue. Now I pour paste wood filler onto the wood. You can apply it with a rag or with a brush, or you can just pour it on and then spread it around. Spread it all over. In my case, I used naphtha to thin it with because I have a small surface. If you're working on a large surface, you might want to use paint thinner because it gives you more working time. Spread the paste wood filler all over the surface and then begin pushing it down into the pores so that you won't have any air bubbles in the pores. You can push it down with the cloth, or you could use a plastic spreader and push it into the pores like this. or you could use a squeegee or any tool that's not going to scratch the wood. Push it into the pores and then let the thinner dry off so that the surface becomes flat in appearance. Then you want to wipe off all of the pastewood filler, wiping across the grain with a coarse cloth like burlap. You can improve the look and feel of any finish by rubbing it after the finish is cured. It's a very easy step that very few woodworkers take advantage of, but people just love to feel a rubbed finish and then tell you how much they like the feel of wood. The easy way to do it is to use 4/0 steel wool, natural or synthetic, and rub the surface. The problem that you're going to have is rubbing up to the edge, because if you rub over the edge, you'll cut the finish off very quickly. So to solve that, rub in short strokes right up to the edge, because then you can control how much you're rubbing. Rub both sides, and then connect the short strokes with long strokes, not going over the edge. To improve the sheen, you can rub using a lubricant. You can use wax or oil, or you can use regular soap and water, or you can use a paste soap and water. The problem is that if you rub through the finish, the lubricant will disguise the rub through and you won't see it. So I recommend that the first few times you rub the surface dry. You can more effectively remove dust nibs by sanding lightly first with 600 grit sandpaper, just enough to make the surface feel smooth. You don't want to use a coarser grit because you'll put scratches in the finish that won't be able to be removed by the steel wool. That's how easy it is.